Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I think we've been fairly well bowled over by how much interest has been in this event, and it's lovely to have you all here. Just as we start thinking about a return to some sort of unusual normal for the next few months and into the next year or so. By way of introduction, my name is Richard Angus. I'm head of education partnerships here at MyTutor. So in terms of what we're here to talk about, obviously, you know, we've got the title here, which is Closing the Attainment Gap. I think we all know, you know, what's going on and what the impact of school closures are going to be on learning, particularly with COVID, and how we've been making some progress on this attainment gap with disadvantaged students, but actually, you know, how do we make sure that we avoid that gap really widening, particularly in the next few years? And whilst this affects all students, today I think we're focusing particularly on year 10 and 12 students who are facing some really big years coming up next year. So we're going to be hearing from fantastic guest speakers, which I'll just pop up here. Laura, Mark, Dele, and Naomi over the course of the next hour and a bit. And hopefully you'll be able to take some concrete issues, concrete insights and ideas away from them into your plans for your schools, both in the summer term, whilst we have a little bit of a practice run before the summer kicks off, and then into September when things get back to some sort of new normal. So during the webinar, if you'd like to submit a question at all, please type your question into, there's a Q&A box there should be on your window, and we'll put those questions to panelists. You can also upvote the other people's questions, which is a really handy way of being able to promote the ones, given that it'll all be a bit tight for time today, to make sure we can get the best questions forward as quickly as possible. So just before we get started, very quick introduction to MyTutor. I think some of you, you know, already know us quite well, but for those that don't, we're an online one-to-one tuition platform, and we work with about 450 schools across the UK to really try and open up access to personalised tuition for students who wouldn't ordinarily be able to afford it. So we match your students with top university tutors to reinforce classwork and fill gaps. We support core subjects primarily, and you know, I think the thing about online is we're doing it now out of necessity, but we've always done it because we believe that that's where you get access to the right tutor regardless of your location, and also into schedules and timetables that are different right across the country. Every school runs very differently. We find that students who make about a grade of progress, where they take about 10 sessions with us, and that's measured across core subjects. I'm happy to deal into a bit more of that, but that's a bit of a whistle-stop piece, I think, just to say hello. But it brings us nicely on to introducing our first guest speakers, Dele and Naomi from the Urswick School, one of our partner schools. Actually, delighted to have them on this chat. Look, I'll let them introduce the school themselves, but they're doing so many things to focus on this gap, and we're delighted to be playing a small part in that. So I'm going to hand over now to Dele and Naomi, who are going to give an insight into their plans for supporting disadvantaged students to catch up on lost learning. Guys, shall I hand the screen sharing over to you?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Go for it, Dele.
Hello. Good afternoon, and good afternoon to all our colleagues across the country. We're delighted to do a presentation on post-COVID and closing the attainment gap for disadvantaged students. I suppose where I would start is by saying that this is obviously topical, but for many schools is an ongoing issue. Schools like my school that has a significant number of disadvantaged students, where we are always having to think about education within the context of disadvantage. So this is a reality. COVID just sharpens the mind in terms of what further disadvantage might have occurred during this period of time. We're certainly not experts. We come to this with the view of sharing information, sharing practice, some of which you might find useful in your context and some of which you might not find useful. What we intend to do today is to cover, first of all, my colleague Naomi will cover some of the national statistics and context around disadvantage and its impact on learning. She will also then introduce you to our own particular context of disadvantage at the Urswick School, which is situated in Hackney. I will look at some of the actions we've taken thus far, some of it pre-COVID actually, some of it during the current crisis, and just give you a flavour of what we are doing, because I think that informs a lot of what we have learned, the learning we continue to have, and what we do moving forward. Naomi will then look at impact and the way we, as schools must continue to judge impact. And finally, I will look at what happens, not post-COVID, but in September, some of the things that we are looking to put into place. So that is the lie of the land for us. I'll hand over to Naomi now to kick off the presentation.
So the first thing is just, I'm sure lots of people know this, but some statistics from summer 2019 in terms of the impact of disadvantage on learning. So if you were a disadvantaged pupil, your average Progress 8 score was minus 0.45 compared to all other students where it was 0.13. So a gap of pretty much 0.6, so more than half a grade. Likewise, looking at English and Maths at grade 5 and above, if you are disadvantaged, you only have a 25% chance of achieving English and Maths at grade 5 or above, compared to other students where they have a chance of 50%. The stats are even worse when you look at EBAC, where getting the EBAC at grade 5 and above, only 7% of disadvantaged students achieve it, compared to 21% of other students, so a threefold difference. And that is part of what we've been trying to address here at the Urswick School. To give you a bit of background to our context, we are, as you can see, the 11th most deprived secondary school in the country. So we have a very heavily deprived cohort in a very heavily deprived area of London. The majority of our students, 72%, are eligible for pupil premium free school meals. Most of our cohort are non-white, about 2/3 are male. And we've really felt the impact of disadvantage in this current crisis. We've seen lots of other schools and other teachers doing various things like Zoom meetings and what have you. We, on the other hand, have done a survey of our Year 10 cohort. Only 64% had internet access, and bearing in mind this might be on mobile phones, they might have to be paying for it. They might not necessarily have it reliably. Only 44% had a suitable device, which again to us has kind of shown that anything we're doing remotely, sort of via Zoom and what have you, isn't going to be hugely successful. And only 53% had a private space in their home where they were able to work. Alongside that, under the current government criteria of having a social worker being vulnerable or your parents being a key worker, we have 243 students who are eligible to attend school on a daily basis. So we have been working along with all of that disadvantage at the moment to try and make sure that our students are supported as much as possible. And Dele is going to talk to you about what we have done so far.
That paints a picture of what we have to cope with here at the Urswick. Significant disadvantage, which impacts on the learning of students on a daily basis. Obviously, that has sharpened the thinking and the thoughts here in terms of exactly how that has been exacerbated during the current lockdown situation. And we have taken some actions thus far, which some have been dictated by things we've done previously, and some have been directed at meeting the ongoing and current need for our students. So I think the first thing that school leadership need to be aware of, especially in the context of of funding and where you get pots of money, is that we need to be a little bit savvy, and we need to be a little bit, I suppose, streetwise in terms of dipping into what are quite a few funding streams out there, whether from charities, whether from the local educational authority, so on and so forth. So with a combination of that kind of thinking, we have been able to target our Year 10 cohort, and we've provided 69 families with laptop devices and 30 with access to the internet. And that's partly through the DFE fund, that is partly through other sources that we've tapped in through charitable sources. Year 12, our year 12 cohort have all been given an iPad for home learning, as well as ensuring that the ongoing scheme we have for providing bursaries for year 12 students, it continues to run, and that students who are experiencing particular hardship during this period can actually apply to us for additional money to aid their learning. Yesterday, we actually decided in terms of the running of the school to widen our use of the library. So the school library has remained open during the crisis. That was initially for sixth form students to come in and use the library. But in discussion yesterday with senior leaders and focusing on the gap that might widen in terms of literacy, we've decided to now make that invitation open to actually any student to come into school for a short period of time. We've written to parents saying no more than 15 minutes to be able to come into the library with the social distancing in place, to borrow a book or to return a book. And as I said previously, we have looked at the myriad of opportunities there to access different types of funding. And I think that in conjunction with your finance director, that is something that all schools will be well advised to look at. We have historically used online tuition at the school for disadvantaged learners. We started that 2 years ago, and we have a history of impact and success using online tuition. We have widened that during the lockdown period, so that all children who have been designated as vulnerable, either working with who have a social worker working with them, or the children of key workers, have been provided not just with normal lessons during the lockdown, but also with online tuition. And we have continued in terms of that mantra of, a well-fed kid is a kid who's more able to focus on learning. We've made sure that apart from the voucher scheme for free school meals, we have provided a free breakfast club to all of those children during the lockdown. Now, it's very important that we continue to track the impact of these of all of these interventions, so that we learn from it and we know perhaps what we take forward come September. And Naomi can speak to you a little bit more about what we're doing in terms of tracking impact.
So what I'm really going to talk about is what we have done in terms of impact since lockdown started. We obviously closed to the majority of learners. As you heard from Dele, we have given the Year 12 cohort, every student, an iPad, which has enabled us to communicate with them, to set them work, and to continue working with them. But we want to check that that distance learning is working. So before half term, we gave every Year 12 a teacher assessment in every subject that they study, and that was purely based on the content that they have been expected to be working on during lockdown. And those have all been sent back to teachers, and teachers are currently marking them, but initial feedback has been very positive, and that it has been, I think, quite successful. For the students who are on site, as you've heard, we are continuing to provide provision both through normal lessons and through online tuition. One of the things that we regularly do as a school on an annual basis we have brought in a package of externally standardized reading age tests and maths age tests. So we are administering those as kind of impact measures for the students who are currently on site. We believe that it will show that they have continued to make progress throughout this time, and we believe that this is a good way of measuring the impact of online tuition, particularly because we have used the funding for online tuition specifically to work on reading and maths, so we are expecting they are the areas that will improve most. Likewise, I think it is important to remember that the current situation will have had a negative impact on some of our students, and there will be gaps where they haven't had the same learning opportunities they normally would. So one of the plans that we have discussed as a leadership team is mock exams for our Year 10 cohort as soon as we are able to reopen and have them, so that we can quickly assess where those learning gaps are, so that the teaching that is now then taking place focuses on where the areas of need are sort of most. And Dele is going to talk to you about what else we are doing as we move forwards.
Okay, so then we move to the great unknown, which is what happens in September, where, God willing, with the vast majority or all of our students are back in learning in some way, shape, or the other. We are anticipating a lot of issues and a spike in terms of the concerns around the emotional and mental health well-being of our students. And therefore, in terms of our future-proofing and looking at those issues and circumstances, we have decided straight away to increase our contact time with either outer agencies employed in school or parts of the school that are best suited to support students in this way. So we do buy-in school counselling. We are increasing that from 1 to 2 days contact with our students. The same with speech and language therapy. We're going up from 1 to 2 days. And also we have increased our contact time with the educational psychologists, who we also buy in, from 5 to 6 days. Strategies are in place to support vulnerable learners as the school reopens. We have a long-standing procedure in this school about identifying vulnerable learners and supporting vulnerable learners. And in the past, we have deemed vulnerable learners to be those who have social and emotional barriers to learning, which preclude any kind of SEN barriers. We are modifying that structure so that it is fit for post-COVID. So we will spend the first half of term identifying students through things like behavior logs, engagement, reports back from heads of learning and heads of department, which students are struggling with homework, where has behavior spiked, which ones are showing behaviors that were hitherto not seen from them. Those students will then be part of our Vulnerable Learners Program, which involves bespoke support put in for those learners, which we track over the course of a year, and just making sure that the strategies are in place to support them. In terms of our use of support staff in core subjects, we have brought in, and we are going to continue with that, high quality staff in maths, English and science, not generic TAs. These tend to be young graduates who are looking to go into teaching at some stage, who have a very, very defined role within those departments. And those roles are around targeted withdrawals of students at the direction of heads of department, academic mentoring with targeted students as well in the sixth form. And then to raise the profile of those core exam groups, we have moved the direct leadership of year 11 and the sixth form under directors of learning, who now sit within the senior leadership team. I think that sends a clear message and also gives it the right kind of focus for those year groups, where we really need to track what is going on in those year groups on a weekly basis. Lastly, we've ring-fenced a pot of money for heads of department to be able to apply directly to the head teacher for specific teaching and learning initiatives that they believe in their departments will help to close specified or identified learning gaps that have developed post-COVID. And that is the end of our presentation. As I say, we're not the experts, but that's just to give you a snapshot of what we are doing here. And hopefully it's some little nuggets there might be useful for you in your settings. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dele and Naomi. That was really, really interesting. There's been lots of questions popping up on the Q&A. So I just wanted to bring up some of those now while we've still got you for 8 minutes. So a big one that's come up is people are quite interested in your sources of funding, where you talked about charitable sources. Wondered if you could share any specifics of ones that you've used.
Yes, I mean, what I can do, which would probably be more useful, is I could send you a link of some of the sources that we have been forwarded to us in the past. My finance director is very, very adept at this, looking at these sources out there, and there are quite a myriad of them as well. And as well, I think there are a lot of local educational authorities who are actively running schemes for disadvantaged learners. And I know, for example, in our context, there was a little bit of bemusement pre-COVID that not enough schools were applying for such schemes. I think that's probably about to change. But Lauren, I could forward some links to you, which probably you could share with some of the participants in the meeting.
That would be amazing. Thank you, Dele. Yeah, yes, please, to that, and then we can send around. Another question that's come up from a few people is this kind of idea of assessment and the potential impact on well-being that might have on students in terms of anxiety levels. Should they be tested in September, or should we wait until October? It would be great to kind of hear your thoughts on that, and whether you've got any plans to kind of mitigate that stress.
So as is very much not going to be a shock to our students. We have been very explicit with our Year 10 students what we are going to test them on. So they've all got topic lists of topics that will be involved in any specific assessments, but we have also sent them kind of letters throughout this period, as well as phone calls, etc., where it has been very explicit that we feel that the best way we can support their learning and help them ultimately to shine at the end of year 11 and then going on obviously into the sixth form and to university is if we give them the best quality teaching for the time they are in school. The best way we can make use of that time is to make sure that we are teaching them the topics that are most relevant to them. So we're not really assessing them to get a grade or anything like that. Is very much an assessment focused on topics they would normally have covered and maybe haven't fully understood, that we need to focus on first. But as I say, I think to reduce the anxiety is really important that that is communicated with students, that it's not surprise you're assessed, but also that it's not a completely blank assessment. They are really clear about what we are asking them as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for that. I think another sort of question that's come up a couple of times from people was specifically around your library and how you've managed to keep that open and allow students to use that. I think a few people mentioned that they've had sort of their own funding and staffing challenges with that. So will be interesting to hear how you guys have got around that.
Sorry, unmute myself. Yes. First of all, we've got a very keen librarian who's been very keen to keep the library open. But like all schools, we've been operating on a skeleton staff. And in our designation of the roles of members of staff that have been in on particular days, one role has consistently been the library and making sure that a member of staff is in the library. As I said, hitherto until yesterday, that the library was open just for sixth formers, but now we feel that we are in a position, and we think it's about right, especially with years 7 to 9, knowing that they will have no contact time in school, that perhaps it's right to be able to let them come in a contained and orderly way to access the library, and at least we can boost one aspect of literacy, which is to encourage and boost reading skills. So that's some of the thoughts around our approach to the library.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question, sorry guys, we've had tons of questions for you. We're not going to be able to get through all of them, but I'm trying to do the most upvoted ones at the moment. So another question we had was around on the online tuition. So a few people have asked for a bit more clarity on how you run that, whether you do it at school or at home, and what your program looks like.
So until lockdown, we ran it once a week for year 11, and that was run after school, supervised by myself and Dele. So once a week for year 11 and once a week for year 10. Since lockdown, they have 3 sessions of English and 3 sessions of maths a week, and that runs in various computer rooms around the school. Every bit of online tuition we've done has taken place in school. We provide all the resources. When we looked at the possibility that MyTutor offer that we could do it at home, we just didn't feel that any of our students would have enough of the facilities at home for it to be viable. In lockdown, it has been supervised by a rota of skeleton staff, so it's not been a consistent single member of staff, but it's been very straightforward to run my kind of management of it. A lot of that's been remote, but the staff who've been on site have found it very easy to make it work. And then we haven't quite decided exactly what we're going to do in terms of setup as we go into the new academic year. I think that's still to be decided.
Okay, great, thank you, Naomi. And we might have time for just one more question, potentially. I've seen a few people asking about your initiatives for vulnerable learners, wondering if you could add any more information about that.
Yes, so we have run in the school now for the past 6 years, I would say, a scheme that's called the Vulnerable Learners Program. And the thinking behind that, when I put that in place, was that we knew that it was very obvious to heads of department and heads of learning when a child had barriers to learning because they had a identified SEN barrier to learning, but that especially in our context, we had a lot of disadvantaged learners who had no diagnosed SEN, but the barriers to learning within the classroom were very, very obvious. They were not engaged with learning, and those barriers tended to be in the realms of social and emotional issues, things outside of school, but they were not SEN needs. We needed to shine the same kind of focus on those kids as SEN kids. So we developed a program where those students were identified by a combination of the inclusion team, heads of departments, and heads of learning. Once those children were identified, and a profile, a one-page profile was developed for each child, saying basically how these barriers to learning manifested in the classroom and what we knew about their backgrounds and what we knew about where some of those barriers came from. The inclusion team and heads of departments, heads of learning, then over the course of a year would start off by looking at those kids in situ in classes, observing them, dropping in, seeing what kind of behaviors they manifested within the classroom. Once we collated all that evidence, the inclusion team, the SENCO and the inclusion team would go away and with heads of department come up with what they felt was the best fit teaching and learning strategies for that child. We then institute those strategies and then let them embed, and then once again go again in a cycle during the course of the year to look at the embedding of those strategies that teachers are doing them, and to speak to the students and to see whether they're gaining any benefit from it. And then at the end of the academic year, we have an impact summary where we look at evidence to see whether there has been any improvement for those children. Yes, in terms of learning, yes, in terms of attainment, but also in terms of attendance, in terms of attendance, and in terms of behavior, so on and so forth. And therefore, we're able to judge impact of the program.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Dele, for answering that, and thank you, Naomi, as well. Yeah, unfortunately, we wouldn't have time to get all those questions in, but I'm going to collect them afterwards, and hopefully we might be able to address some of them after the webinar. And certainly we can look at trying to get some of those links sent around. But thank you very much, guys. I know you need to shoot off to close the school now.
Yep.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Stay safe.
Righto. Well, that was fabulous. And loads of things there. It's lovely, you know, when to be able to share ideas around. And I know lots of people are doing lots of different things. So it's great to see what Urswick are doing to tackle the school, particularly with such a high amount of disadvantage in the school. So brilliant. Well, we're about bang on time. So I'd love to move on to our next speaker at this point. Former teacher and editor of Schools Week, the co-founder of Teacher Tapp, Laura McInerney. So welcome, Laura.
Hello. I guess I go ahead and share my screen at this point then, Richard. Fantastic.
Yes, please.
Okay, so let's get this presentation on the go. So what I'm going to be talking about today is what the 8,500 teachers that are on Teacher Tapp each day have told us about lockdown. And I guess from Dele and Naomi, what you just heard was what's happening in one school. This is going to give us more of a shot of what's happening across all schools. And some of it might seem pretty obvious because there'll be things that you'll already know from your own context. But one of the things Teacher Tapp does really well, obviously, is let you know how normal you are. So this might be a really good test of what you think is happening in lockdown is actually happening. And if what's happening in your school and your plans are similar to what's happening elsewhere. Just before I move into the first slide, Richard and Lauren, would it be possible just for you to give a thumbs up if you can hear and see everything okay? Brilliant. So we know that the rest of you should be able to see and hear it as well. So just in case you don't know what Teacher Tapp is, it's an app that looks a bit like what you're seeing on the screen now. We started it 3 years ago as a way of helping teachers take part in research and really find out what's happening on the ground in schools. Every day it pings on teachers' phones, and then about 8,500 teachers get given a set of questions, usually 3 questions. Teachers answer them. And then at the end of that, they get to see the results. The questions can be about anything. When we started, we wanted to know about what was normal in school. So for a long time, we looked at things like, where did you eat your lunch? Or what happened in your class that day? Obviously, for the last few months, what we've worked out is what's weird now, all the things that are no longer normal. But it does mean that we're in a great position because we've got data for the last 3 years, pretty much, of normal times. We've got data throughout this whole period, and hopefully going forwards, if you're on Teacher Tapp, please keep tapping because it does help us get more data. If you'd like to join, it's free, it's very easy to sign up, and you just get it from the App Store. As I say, each day once you've done your questions, you get to see the results. And then there's a little bit where we give some CPD, a sort of daily read, and badges and streaks. And Mark Enser, who you're going to see after me, is one of our super users. I believe Mark said earlier he's on something like a 999-day streak. So it is a pretty good app once you get into it. There you go, so that's a little bit what it is. Then what are we finding? What have we found about loss of learning during lockdown? Well, we've been finding out rather a lot because it turns out that when you have 8,500 teachers answering every day, there's tons of things that you can find. But one graph in particular has been picked up the most. I think this is the one that was retweeted by Andrew Adonis. It's certainly the one that was used by The Economist. It was used by the Financial Times. It's been referred to in education select committees over and over again. And it's because we asked teachers what they were doing on one particular day. And I'm going to put the graph up. There's quite a lot that's going on with it. So I've waited until now, but I'm going to put it up and then I'm going to give you maybe 10, 20 seconds just so you can see what you notice. What's the first things that you notice? So you might need to move your video bar depending on how you've got the setup. But what do you notice? And I'm just going to see if I don't think I can see the chat. Possibly I can. Yes, I can. If you can see anything, just stick it in the chat and hopefully I'll be able to take a quick look. I like whoever that was who's put I love Teacher Tapp in the chat. You're obviously my new favorite. So Cheryl Holt is the first person to get in there with this. The Zoom live lessons. That is exactly what everybody else has noticed as well. So this is the thing that got the Financial Times and the Economist and everybody else very excited. They noticed that people were in private schools posting online streamed lessons. 52% of private primary schools, and this is even back in March, were doing Zoom lessons most of the day, as were private secondary schools. Of course, when you compare that to the numbers doing this in the state primary and the state secondary, it looks very different. Unfortunately, what some people took from this was the idea that this meant nothing at all was happening in state schools, which is a mistake because, of course, you can see at the bottom that there are plenty of other things happening, including, for example, recording and posting online videos for students to watch. Although that was only 21% and 14% in state primary and state secondary back in March when we did this particular version of the questions, as we've rolled forwards, that's gone up and up and up. So now closer to around 35% of that happening. We've also got worksheets, we've got video calls and phone calls to parents. But also, importantly, this was just talking about what teachers were doing on the day and not what pupils were doing on that given day. So this second graph shows us for a class on a Monday during lockdown, we got the teachers to think about what would your class be doing now that they're at home. And you can actually see that there's a lot more parity between the two. So online learning platforms for setting and collecting work have been pretty well used across almost all types of schools. Less so in state primary, but certainly if you're in a state secondary, 82% of people are using some kind of online learning platform to set or collect work, and in similar numbers in primary, private primary and private secondary. You do see there is a bit of a difference in state primary schools, and sometimes people have thought that this was because primary schools were just kind of giving up or their teachers didn't know anything about technology. But in many cases, it's because when you're dealing with younger children, they're not only less likely to be able to access the technology, but also they're much less likely to have their own device. So frankly, there's not many 5-year-olds who've got their own laptop. There's not even that many 5-year-olds who've got their own iPads. It's often something that's shared by the whole family. And I certainly know that when you look at, for example, what's happening in Oak Academy at the moment, they've had people access their internet stuff from PS4s, from really, really old phones. So we know that not everybody has access to their devices. I can see a couple of people in chat there are asking about what's the split of users of Teacher Tapp. Just so you know, these data is reweighted to be representative. So we actually use the workforce census, and that enables us, although we might have slightly different numbers of primary and secondary or different ages or different experiences of teachers, we are able to reweight it to make it representative. So these figures are not a product of who's on the app, they are a product of what seems to be going on. Our margin of error is actually very, very low because of the large number of the sample. Just to go back to primary for a second, what we do know with primary is therefore instead of using online learning platforms, many primary schools decided to go either for emails to class parents, as their class or to parents, they went for instructions being posted on their website, or in many cases for young children, and particularly in state secondary schools that are in deprived areas, we saw a decision taken by those schools to send home physical workbooks and physical worksheets. Again, although this has shifted slightly because this particular version of the data was asked on 26th of March, we've seen a slight shift throughout April as some schools have slightly more moved to video and online and Zoom calls, but actually it's stayed fairly static. The primary schools, because they were furthest behind, had the furthest to go, but they were also told earlier that they could stop and that they would be going back. So there hasn't been the same level of investment in online calling or online systems as we've seen in secondary schools. So we know that there is a difference between how you're being taught, but between private and state schools. And we can also see a little bit of a difference between primary and secondary. But none of this tells us how much work that the pupils are actually doing. So if we go on to the next bit. One of the questions we asked our teachers, and we did ask it for primary, but I'm going to show you right now the secondary results. We asked them, how much work do you think a Year 8 student should be doing each day if you want them to be sort of staying on top of their work and thinking similarly to what they'd be doing in school, And then how much do you think they will be doing, or how much do you think they are doing? And I'm just going to reveal one section first, because again, it's quite a big graph. At the top there, we've got 2 bars, and this is all of the teachers who are in fee-paying schools. What the top bar shows you is what percentage of teachers said they should be working for certain numbers of hours. And if you look down this right-hand side to the key, if it's green, it's either 3 or 4 hours, 5 or 6 hours or more. If it's purple, it's at the lower end, 1 or 2 hours per day, and that dark purple is less than 1 hour. So coming back to the main bar chart. Within fee-paying schools, well, most teachers say that a Year 8 student, who'll be about 13, should be doing at least 3 or 4 hours per day, or 5 or 6 hours. The vast majority agree 3 or 4 hours is the minimum. What will these pupils be doing? Well, the estimate of the teachers, based on the work they were seeing, getting back, or the conversations they were having, is that they would be doing, most of them, around 3 or 4 hours or more. And if you think about it, if you're in a fee-paying school and you're doing lots of Zoom calls, you're sitting with pupils all day, it's much like being in a classroom and chatting to pupils, then you can see why it might be that those pupils carry on getting at least 3 or 4, 5 or 6 hours per day in terms of their learning time. The next reveal is going to show you FSM Q1. So this shows you teachers who are in schools that have the least number of free school meal pupils. Of course, free school meal pupils are those from low-income families. So this is the school teachers in schools where there are the fewest of those pupils, that is, they're the most affluent schools. You'll notice that although a higher number said that people should only be doing 1 or 2 hours per day, still the majority said 3 or 4 hours should be the minimum amount that somebody is doing. And yet, in terms of what they will be doing, we now have the majority of teachers saying it would be 2 hours or less. And that's already in the most affluent state schools. So it does seem like there is a difference purely in the fact that because state schools haven't been in a position most of the time to do those online lessons all day, and they may not even be that great in terms of the actual learning experience, there starts to be a bit of a drop-off in terms of how much work is getting done. And then when we reveal the rest of the picture, well, I mean, can anybody guess what the rest of the picture is going to look like? If you have a think, how much worse do we think this is going to get for those pupils that are in the FSM 5 school? As you can see, you go to FSM Q5, and now we're looking at 43% of teachers saying that their Year 8s are working less than 1 hour a day on average. Now, we've also done a range of different ways of asking this question. For example, we asked it in terms of how much work are you getting back? We've asked what percentage of your pupils are sending no work in. And again, you see a huge gap that goes, almost nobody in a private school says that a pupil has handed nothing in. And by the time you get down to that FSM quintile 5, they reckon, it's about 15% are saying that they're getting substantial amounts of pupils not giving them any work whatsoever. So there is quite a big difference between the two of these, between the top and the bottom. And when we get to learning loss, I don't think that we can get away from the fact that there is likely to be some level of effect. That said, we asked the teachers to tell us why this might be. And one of the things that we've heard a lot is it technology? I'm just going to read this through without the boxes, because often when I'm doing TV and radio at the moment, showing these figures, I get asked something like this from radio people. They'll say, well, in the most deprived schools, teachers say that more of their students don't have adequate access to an electronic device for learning from home compared to those in the most affluent state schools. And that seems pretty straightforward. But actually, how many teachers are reporting this? How many students don't have adequate access to an electronic device? And how different is it when we compare it to the most affluent state schools? Well, in the most deprived schools, remember that's quintile 5, that is the 20% of schools in the poorest area, only 15% of teachers report that more than a third of their students don't have adequate access to an electronic device. Now, this does compare to only 2% in the most affluent state schools. But actually what we found when we dug into the detail here is there are some schools, the most deprived areas, like those that Dele and Naomi were talking about, who do have substantial number of pupils who don't have any access to an electronic device and don't have any access to the internet. But for the vast majority of pupils across the country, there is at least some access to a device and there is at least some access to the internet, enough to enable them to do work. And we were quite surprised to find that even in the most affluent state schools and even in private schools, there are still students who don't have access to these things. So it's a little bit the technology, but there's something much bigger. You see, we asked teachers to think about all of those pupils who are giving them no work, and then to come up with the top 3 reasons. Now, in state schools, the second biggest reason was the technology, so I'm not dismissing it, it is important. But private schools and state schools both had the same top reason and the same third reason. And I'll give you a clue with private schools. That middle one was actually study skills, which is interesting. It seems that private schools are quite worried that their own pupils don't have the ability to study by themselves, because the private schools are so effective at ensuring that pupils are kind of trained for their exams. As soon as the teachers have been switched off, they've actually really struggled. Now, that didn't come up within the state school sector, so well done, state school teachers. It seems like you are drilling independence much more into your pupils. But what do we think the P and the A are? These are the things that meant that people did not get their work in. I can see some people already putting their ideas in so far. I've got a couple. Yeah, you guys are absolutely getting this correct. Yeah, it is parents and attitude. Parents and attitude by some considerable way. I mean, parents by some considerable way, and then very close behind with study skills and attitude, or technology and attitude. This is the reason why pupils are not doing work according to their teachers. What's really interesting then, when we think about learning loss and going back to school, is going back to school doesn't actually solve that much of this. In the case of the private schools, it solves the study schools issue. And in the case of state schools, it somewhat solves the technology issue. But the fact is, parents who are not supportive of you at school can be pretty problematic anyway. And not having a positive attitude to learning is already quite difficult. And so when we think about learning loss, sometimes I think people are getting themselves into getting a bit het up about the idea that because school hasn't been on for a few months, gigantic learning differences have opened up. Honestly, they were probably already there. And yes, it means that parents have more influence for more hours. But also, I think what this has actually done is it's really just shone a light on big differences that already existed. And now, frankly, we can't just paper up the cracks and for a few hours a day try and make everything okay. I think we've had to really get into the fact that parents are fundamental. And many schools now have a changed relationship with parents. They've spoken to them a lot more. They've had to rely on them a lot more. And that is probably the area, I think, where schools can, going forwards, make the biggest difference. If you can continue that communication and help the parents support the next stage of learning, that is going to be enormously valuable. So just to sum up, when it comes to what we've learned from 8,500 teachers about lockdown learning, it really depends who we're talking about. The private school experience has been different to the state school experience, but I wouldn't in any sense want to say that state schools haven't been working hard. They've just been doing very, very different things. They've been emailing, they've been marking work, they've been setting lessons, they've been putting things on online platforms, they've been sending work out, they've been ensuring that food gets out to families. There's been a lot going on. But as a child, your experience will be different. The same if you're in an affluent community versus deprived community, and what you'll have been doing is different. Live Zoom lessons, I've got some friends who are parents in the private sector, and they frankly said that they would pay the private school to stop doing them all day long, because actually 6 or 7 hours of it is too much. But you might have had an online experience, you might have had an offline experience, and then why are those gaps coming up? A little bit technology, it needs to be resolved, but otherwise those other learning barriers, it's just exacerbated those, and getting on top of them as we go forwards will be really important. I am going to stop share and come back.
Superb. Thank you so much, Laura. So much really interesting, so many interesting insights in there. And if you guys have digested that, think of the questions you might want to ask. We're going to be coming back to a panel as a group between Laura and Mark, and I'm sure she'd welcome them coming forward. So I think that takes us really nicely on to introducing Mark Enser. test columnist, author, head of geography research lead and SLE at Heathfield Community College. So Mark, have you got your screen there to share for us?
I hope so.
Looking good.
Yeah, we're all sorted. Excellent. Okay. I'd like to take a slightly different approach to this question of the disadvantage gap. And what I really want to have a look at is what the root cause of disadvantage is. And if we can establish what it is, what can we then do about it? So what I'm talking about today really started with a conversation that we had as a school with Becky Allen, who's also associated with Teacher Tapp, and a talk that she gave at Research Ed a few years ago, looking at the problems with pupil premium as this really blunt tool to identify who is actually disadvantaged. And she suggested that instead we needed to look at what was behind it. You know, if we say that pupils are educationally disadvantaged, why is that? What does it actually mean? What is disadvantaging them? And the research evidence suggests that there might be 3 causes that we could investigate that help us to understand this gap. And this is lack of prior knowledge, poor working memory, and difficulties with attention. And the reason this creates the disadvantage gap is because it affects how we learn. If you look at the diagram at the bottom of the screen there, we can see the multi-store model of memory, which is probably the most widely used kind of way of representing learning and representing memory that we tend to have. And what this suggests is that those 3 factors play a really significant role in how we learn. So if we start at the beginning with our sensory store, so we have information coming at us all of the time, and our sensory store holds on to that information for just a few split seconds. So for instance, at the moment, I'm sat at my desk and into my sensory store are coming the books on the bookshelf in front of me. I can see little, works of art around here. I can see the mess on my desk. I can hear the birds outside the window. And all of this is flooding my sensory store. If I wasn't looking for that, it would drop out immediately. I wouldn't think about it. I wouldn't engage in it. What stands as the gatekeeper is our attention. And our attention allows things to come into our working memory. So if I, for instance, focus on my bookshelf and I can see there the best-selling book, Making Every Geography Lesson Count, that's now in my working memory. I'm now looking at it, thinking about it, holding on to the title of that book because I'm paying attention to it, and everything else can drop away. And we know that some people are better able to pay attention than others, and our ability to pay attention is something that we can establish at the age of around 2 or 3, and that predicts academic success to a scary degree. So our ability to pay attention and to filter things out of our attention is vitally important. And it seems to be somewhat fixed at a young age. So I've now got that book title in my working memory, and I can hold it in. That's one piece of information. I can hold that in my working memory quite easily because I can hold a number of things in my working memory. The exact number is always debated, and we'll say 4 and 7 items of information. So if I now look, then I go, the next book up there is Bringing Knowledge Back In. I've got Teacher Agency, Hyper-Socialised, Teaching Secondary Geography as if the Planet Matters, Global Perspectives, and the Geography Curriculum. And if I'm trying to hold all those titles in my head, that becomes much more difficult. So I've got too much information now in there. Plus, in my working memory, I need to process anything that I'm trying to learn. So I've now also, if someone then says to me, okay, what do those books have in common? I've now got to try and remember the name of all of those books, and I've got to think about the thing that they have in common. And that's going to overwhelm my working memory. And the reason this is important in terms of disadvantage is that our working memory is very different person to person. Some people have a much greater working memory than others. And again, it correlates to socioeconomic status. There is a link there that we'll explore in a bit more detail in a moment. And our working memory is what allows us to learn things. We have to hold things in our working memory in order to think about it, in order to transfer it into our long-term memory, which is then our prior knowledge. But if we can't have enough in our working memory, if we can't think about things in our working memory, we can't transfer things into our long-term memory, and we can't learn it. The long-term memory is also important because that prior knowledge helps our working memory. It helps to support it and structure it. If those book titles I had in my long-term memory, and someone said to me, oh, those books, what do they have in common? I don't have to remember all of their titles in my working memory. They're there in my long-term memory. I can just start answering the question and calling on what I know. And our prior knowledge, again, it depends on our background. Some people are going to have more prior knowledge than other people. They're going to be exposed to more things than other people. They're going to have more to call on than others. So if we think about the root of disadvantage, when we talk about pupils being disadvantaged, I would suggest that what we mean are these three things. They lack prior knowledge, they might struggle with their working memory, and they might have difficulty in paying attention. If those three things are true for you, you are going to be disadvantaged in terms of education. And the reason we have a gap with economic disadvantage and the kind of the pupil premium gap is because those things are more common in people from lower socioeconomic status for a range of different reasons. And this is where it gets really complicated and gets a bit tricky. But there is some interesting research out there. I'm going to focus very much on the kind of working memory aspect of this. So there's some interesting research from Dickerson and Popley, who found that poverty, especially in very early childhood, had a significant impact on cognitive development. And some earlier research suggests the reason why this is likely to be the case, from Evans and Schamberg, who suggested that it was trauma. And by trauma, they don't actually mean a particularly unpleasant, nasty event, but stress, the kind of stress that comes from financial difficulty, of being in a stressful environment, can have an impact on working memory. Now, although it might correlate to kind of financial disadvantage, of course, it's not a perfect match. It's not saying that everyone who struggled financially or whose parents struggled financially, their children are going to have difficulties with working memory. They're just more likely to. And likewise, you might actually grow up in an incredibly financial secure situation and still have trouble with working memory. And this is why pupil premium is such a blunt measure of things like disadvantage. We actually need to establish who has difficulty with their working memory, and then we can put things in place to support them. We can't just look at our list of free school meals or pupil premium and hope that's going to do it for us. It's too blunt a tool. And it's quite easy to test working memory. There's a whole range of tests you can find online that do it, involving number codes, or that are just kind of like the 20 items on a tray, look at them for 30 seconds, take them away, how many can you remember? There are various ways of testing working memory, so we can identify who has issues with it. And it's important, because if we go back to our model, if our working memory is affected, then everything else is as well. We can't learn because we can't process information as easily. It really is going to matter. So in terms of solutions, what can we do about it? Well, there are things that we can do in class, not very easily at the moment, but when we're back and more pupils are back in school, there are things that we can do. So we can put supports in place for working memory. So for instance, if we're discussing something with a class, we're having kind of a class discussion or some teacher explanation, we can leave bullet points up on the board so that pupils can refer back to them after we finish talking. The problem with language is that it's very transient. We say a word and it's vanished. There's nothing to pin it down unless you've held it in your working memory. So we can put those bullet points up on the board. We can also make use of diagrams. So often when I'm describing something in geography, how a waterfall is formed, I'll draw it at the same time as I'm explaining it. I can then leave that diagram on the board when pupils come to answer a question about how waterfalls are created and change over time. It's there to prompt their memories. Sometimes, though, we might not want everyone to have those prompts, because that might be scaffolding too much. We want most of the class to be retrieving things from their memory to aid them in doing the task. We don't want to give them too much support, but some pupils will need it. So a really simple solution there is the use of mini whiteboards. So if pupils have a mini whiteboard on their desk and a pupil is likely to struggle with their working memory, we can give them a few prompts. We can give them a quick diagram, a few sentence starters, a few things that they might want to use that they can refer back to. Another really important thing to consider is reducing distractions. So as I said, you've got all of this sensory information around us, and some pupils are going to struggle with paying attention to the thing that we need them to pay attention to. So if we can reduce distractions, we can help not overload someone's working memory, because they're not thinking about everything. they're thinking about the things they need to know in order to learn the thing we want them to learn. So there's various ways to do this. Things like personal devices, mobile phones or iPads or laptops or Google, whatever you happen to use, can be incredibly distracting as well as incredibly useful in other contexts. If people don't need to use them at that time, then they need to be away if they're not going to cause a distraction. Distractions can be caused by other things in the environment, overly garish displays, hundreds of keywords scattered around the front of the room. People don't know which one to pay attention to. They're just there bombarding them with information. Noise in the classroom, obviously, pupils talking over each other. It's going to be a massive problem for our most disadvantaged students. So we need to think about that. So if we can manage distractions, we can make it much easier for pupils to learn, especially pupils who are disadvantaged in terms of their ability to pay attention. So these are some kind of in-class solutions. The one that I really wanted to focus on for this session are the things that we can do out of class, because remote learning is going on for a lot of our pupils for a lot longer. And so this becomes very, very important. And I think what we can focus on here are elements of self-regulation. This is something we've really focused on as a geography department and increasingly as a school. And we found it's not only helped to close the gap in terms of economic disadvantage, kind of pupil premium figures, but it's been incredibly important for the gender gap as well, and for closing that. So when we talk about self-regulation, we really mean three different things. So our three components of self-regulation that we can focus on. The first are cognitive strategies. So they're the things that we, the activities that pupils are doing that we think will lead to learning. So in the case of out of school learning, they're our kind of study skills, our revision strategies, the kind of thing that Laura was talking about, independent pupils might be struggling with. So we need to give them the cognitive strategies. We also need the metacognitive strategies, pupils' ability to monitor what they're learning, to be aware of what they have and haven't learned, and what things worked and what things didn't. That's really, really tricky to get right. And then finally, we've got the social and emotional strategies of self-regulation. So these are the things that involve motivation, the ability to delay gratification, the ability to get on and do it, to actually spend the time working. And again, it kind of leaned into those Teacher Tapp figures about the pupils doing less than an hour's work a day, or those pupils not handing any work in. That might be the social and emotional strategies. What's going to tie you to the desk and get the job done. And there are things that we can do for each of these to say that close that gap in terms of economic disadvantage, but also gender as well. I'll touch on both because I think they're things that we're all prioritising at the moment. So the cognitive strategies, making sure pupils have learned what we intend them to learn. So first thing to consider is that not all revision techniques are equal. Not all study skills are equal. When I started off teaching 17 or so years ago, I seem to get older every time I do one of these, but we used to say to the kids, you've got to find your own way to revise. Everyone has their own methods. And there might be a tiny kernel of truth in that, but there's more lie than truth. There are some things that we know work really well with revision and some things we know just aren't very effective at all. I'd urge anyone who hasn't come across it already to read Dunlosky's Strengthening the Student Toolbox. Really good, easily accessible, research-informed way to approach revision. Getting people to highlight text, to read through their notes is not going to be as effective as self-quizzing, as self-explanation, as summarising. These are going to work much more effectively. The problem is pupils are less likely to choose effective revision techniques. They are likely to choose the less effective ones because they don't involve as much thought. And as Daniel Willingham points out in Why Don't Students Like School, humans are essentially lazy when it comes to thinking. If we can avoid thinking, we will. Thinking is uncomfortable. It is much easier to look through your notes and get that lovely, cozy feeling of knowing something. You look at it, go, oh, I remember doing this. That's comforting. Testing yourself, that's threatening. Going, I don't know that. That's not as nice. So no wonder people avoid it. So we need to keep that in mind. If we just leave it to pupils, they are likely to choose less effective techniques. And that is especially true when it comes to gender as well. So thinking about those gaps that we might want to close, there is a lot of research out there that shows that boys are less likely to choose effective revision strategies than girls. A really interesting research out there. I've got a PES article. If you have a little search, I can send around a link that kind of links to the research. There was a really interesting piece that said that if you stripped out everything other than whether pupils revise effectively, you no longer see a gap. Gender gap vanishes. If you look at boys who revise the same way that the majority of girls are revising, the gender gap goes. The disadvantage gap goes. So much of it comes down to these study skills. So in terms of what we can do, I think, some kind of little action plans, we need to have a think about which revision strategies we actually want to promote. We need to do that research as the experts in learning to know what is going to be most effective. And then we need to ensure that all students are using those effective strategies, that it isn't simply left up to chance. So one way we've done this is we've taken this was originally created by Victoria Hewitt at Mrs. Humanities on Twitter. Superb blog, some fantastic resources. Again, I would suggest anyone goes and has a look at Purloin's. But what we do is we just kind of modified and edited this for our classes, but we give this to our classes, GCSE classes, straight after the mocks, so kind of in January, and it tells them exactly how to revise each bit of each topic all the way through to the exam. So we say, create revision cards on this, create a mind map on this, and we teach them how to do those things, and we say, you need to do it on this week. So this week, this is how you're going to revise these things in this way. And we tell them how to do it and how to do it effectively. But it means there's no kind of opt-out. There's no, oh, well, yes, I wasn't sure how to do that. I wasn't sure how to revise. I didn't know what to do. Or, oh, yeah, I revised that topic. I looked through my notes. No, that's how you need to do it. It also gives them the chance to practice lots of different revision techniques. If we want them to be independent eventually, this teaches them how to do that. This is how you make mind up. This is how you do that in the correct way. So that's been hugely helpful. We give these out at Parents' Evening as kind of paper copies, so parents can be involved as well, bring them on board and let them know how they can support their pupils. So in terms of metacognitive strategies, the ability of pupils to monitor what they've learned, again, there are some quite complex issues here. The first is our human nature to overestimate their ability. Novices are much more likely to do this than experts because you don't know how little you know. Most people think they're better than average drivers. And again, Teacher Tapp's got some really interesting data looking at teachers. Most teachers on Teacher Tapp think they're better than average teachers. It is that kind of human nature to think you're doing better than other people are. And the same thing comes with revision. Pupils tend to overestimate what they know. So they'll look at something, go, I don't know, I want you to revise tectonics, and they'll look at it and go, oh, I know this. And they might, whilst they're looking at it, but they wouldn't if they actually quizzed themselves. So it's an issue. And again, especially an issue in terms of gender. Lots of studies that show that males are more likely to be overconfident than females. Lots of these studies done in things like the stock market and looking at financial decisions and things, much more likely to be overconfident. So we've got a gender gap as well as a potential disadvantage gap. So in terms of overcoming it, we need ways where students can really monitor what they have and have not learned. And we need to make sure that students have a really realistic appraisal, but without destroying their confidence. Because what we don't want to do is say to them, oh, you know nothing at the end of the course. That's going to be perhaps even more worrying for them than kind of being able to do it in a much more structured way. So again, the way that we've tried to do this is we use personalised learning checklists, like lots of people do. So these are our PLCs. And what we make sure that we do, that these ones that, again, we've chosen to use, we didn't create these, there's just a massive amount of resources out there, but we deliberately chose ones where rather than just giving a list of topics that they needed to know, everything is designed as a task. It's an activity. So define the term natural hazard. Or can you do it? You either write it down or turn to your neighbour or explain it to yourself. Can you identify the types? And well, go on, do it. You can't just tick it and go, oh, that's fine, I can do it. Actually do it to make sure that you know it. And that tiny modification to the way that we were organising our learning checklists had a big impact. They've now become a learning tool. And pupils now can really identify what they do and don't know because it is done as a task. So check whether you can do it or not. Finally, looking at those social and emotional strategies, I think these are the trickiest to get right, those ones involving kind of motivation, that willingness to do things. And we found especially willingness to ask for help. And again, we have a gender gap here. So Silverman suggests that females are more likely to delay gratification than males from that research. Very important when it comes to things like revision. Are you actually going to sit down and do it now, or are you going to go play on your computer or do something else instead? There's also, we have to take into account things like fatalism. You know, do you believe that actually spending some time studying is going to make a difference? And lots of things affect fatalism. Lots of cultural factors, historic factors affect fatalism. If you don't believe that you can make any difference to your life, if you don't believe you have agency to improve things, then you're not going to bother. And we really see that with the economic disadvantage gap. If you think there's no point in revising harder, then of course you're not going to do it. So we have to overcome that in some way as well. And again, with gender, we know that males are less willing to ask for help. The old cliche of asking for directions when you're lost, you know, it's a cliche for a reason. There are studies to back this up. There is a gap in these things. So we have to try and find a way of changing beliefs of our students. We know that growth mindset, you know, Carol Dweck's work is frequently called into question. It might be lovely to have a growth mindset. It looks like it's very, very difficult to actually change someone's mindset. And we need to make sure pupils can find the support that they need. And it's that second one that we found we had the most power to change. We just use our VLE, and we just make it really, really easy for pupils to access the things that they need to. So on our virtual learning environment, we use Firefly. We just make sure everything's there. So here's the links that you need. Click on that and it will take you to the thing that you want. Here's the advice on effective revision. Here's a link to the quizzes on BBC Bitesize. Just click on it. It's there. It is easy. There are no excuses not to do it. Here are the learning checklists. Here are the past questions. Here are the revision materials. Every single thing is there for you to use all in one place. It just removes that sense of not knowing what to do. That fatalism that, well, I can't do it. You can, it's there, and we can monitor who is accessing this and who isn't, and then we can go and talk to those people who aren't and find out why not, and that way they don't have to approach us and ask for help. We can approach them because we realise they must need help because they haven't done the thing that they needed to do. So kind of the conclusions that I have in terms of closing the disadvantage gap is that it might be explained by differences in working memory, and I think this could be really significant. We can increase working memory capacity. We can't increase working memory capacity. What we can do is support working memory capacity. So we can support working memory in class, we can support attention, and we can increase what's in long-term memory through effective revision. If you're interested in anything more about this, Teach Like Nobody's Watching. You can currently get with 30% off at Crown House Publishers. Just use code CPD30. And in fact, any of their books at the moment are 30% off with that code. And all of those strategies and ideas are discussed in there. Or get in touch with me at Enser Mark on Twitter. I'm always on there. And hopefully we've got a bit of time to answer some questions as a panel at the end anyway. So thank you very much. I hope there was something there that was useful for you to take away.
That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Laura, as well. Tons of questions coming through, and you covered so many interesting topics there. So I'm going to try and get through, while we've got a few minutes left, just some of the questions that were raised while you were both talking. So first of all, for Laura, one of the questions that came through was around whether you just happen to have any sort of comparable insights for in-school times. So when we're looking at things like pupil engagement and work being done, with some of the data points that you showed there, was there anything comparative that you had?
Not really, just because it's such an unusual circumstance in terms of, I think we've probably got some stuff around, I'm not even sure if we've got anything around like how many of your pupils have completed the work. I'm not sure that would have been one that we'd have thought about. Certainly we've done stuff about homework before now, and you know, you always see the differences between affluents and those who are in areas of deprivation in terms of things like homework engagement. We've tracked behaviour for a very long time. Obviously you see a big difference on those as well. If I can, Lauren, just to pick up, there was a question there about the EEF, and it wasn't in the Q&A, it was in the chat, so I just want to make sure it gets picked up because it's really important, and a few people mentioned it, which is that I think it was either today or yesterday, the Education Endowment Foundation has put out a report saying, you know, there's likely to be gigantic learning gaps and that lots and lots needs to be done. I think a few people felt that maybe I was saying this wasn't true. That's not the case. I definitely think there are going to be learning gaps. I also think that we just have to be slightly more realistic. When the EEF's report came out yesterday, it said that the learning gap was likely to increase somewhere between 11% and 75%, which is massively different. And I guess I'm just on the end where I think to myself, if you think how important parents and families and attitude to learning are, which is massive, and if you think about how many weeks in a child's life has been disrupted, it's going to have an impact, but actually those things stay. So even when you come back to school, I suppose what I wanted to say is the opportunity is about addressing those things when those children come back as well. And if you can do all the things that Mark's just talked about and get ready with the learning gaps, I think we can actually fill in a lot of those things already, but we can't solve parents and attitudes. But that wasn't me saying that the EF was wrong. It's just I would be more on the sort of 20 to 30% end than the 75% end.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. There's a big range there. Okay, so maybe to come back to Mark, we had one question come up that was around how can you develop the working memory for students identified individually? If you could shed any light on that.
Yeah, so I'm afraid you can't. Sorry. You can't improve working memory capacity. These things, they do develop as pupils get older, but their upper limit is probably fixed. So that by the time they come to us at school, we can't increase their working memory capacity. What we can do, if we identify pupils who struggle with working memories, we can support it. So that's where we make sure we differentiate appropriately through the use of scaffolds. So leaving notes on the board, giving them diagrams, giving them sentence starters, giving them prompts, making sure we don't introduce too much new information at any one time, given a chance for practice, frequently after small amounts of information. That's what we do, is that effective teaching, but we can't improve their capacity. I'd suggest anyone who's interested, a really accessible paper is Gathercole and Alloway's work on working memory capacity, mainly focused on primary school, but very interesting kind of insight into what working memory means and the kind of the limits that working memory might create.
Okay, no, that's brilliant, thank you. There was another quite interesting question, which, I mean, would be great to hear from both of you on this. It was from Hannah Matthews, who said, it seems that focusing on mindset and attitude and self-regulation skills is vitally important in addressing the gap. This will be a challenge when we have uncertainty of the 2021 exams and we may be under pressure to cover lots of content quickly. To what extent should we sacrifice content to focus on mindset, or is there a way to do both?
Mark, do you want to go first, or should I jump in? Go for it. So I was a PSHE and citizenship teacher, and I saw somewhere else in either one of the questions or comments, somebody said to Mark, actually, is this something that these kind of skills, are you able to teach them through PSHE? And that's often where this kind of self-regulation stuff is placed. And funnily enough, I did a master's in positive psychology at one point in 2008, because I was actually really into this idea, and I thought that that's the way it should be, and you should teach all of these things separately. And actually, after 2 years of looking at it, I sort of came to the decision that you could teach these things in any subject, and you can teach them in lots of different ways. And so I'm not necessarily a fan of the idea that you have to teach mindset specifically in its own PSHE lesson. And in fact, I think that might even be quite dangerous, because kids walk in and think, oh, it's PSHE, this is where I use my emotional regulation. And then they go to Mark's class and they're like, geography, that we don't use that here is about other stuff. So I think it's really important going forwards. It's going to have to be something that's taught, but I think everybody teaching it is going to be really useful. And just fascinating for me still that those private school teachers said that their students struggled with study skills, when we're so often taught in the state sector that actually the private sector is supposed to be some kind of paragon for this. So I think no one is doing it particularly brilliantly, but we've all got to try.
I completely agree. I'll just add, it might be worth having a look at the EEF report on metacognition. One thing that they recommend is that these kind of study skills are taught in subject specific areas for those areas. So the way that we do concept mapping in geography might be very different to the way that history would approach it, and so on. So these skills are very important, but they might not transfer especially well So we might want to teach them in quite specific ways in some occasions. So it might be worth checking out the EF report.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you both. I know, Mark, that you touched on some kind of the gender aspects when you were speaking, but there was a question that was around saying, our PP students generally do well, but our PP girls are weaker than boys. Why might this be? Just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Not off the top of my head. It could be for so many different reasons. It could be lack of confidence. It could be peer pressure. That, you know, there's such a huge variety of potential causes. I don't know your students, I'm afraid. I suspect you'd have a better idea than I would. Sorry.
Fair. No, completely fair. Another question that's just come in: do we think there will be exams next year, honestly? Or another round of ranking, hoping for the best? Just throwing this one out there, would be great to hear your opinions, Laura and Mark.
I'll come in on this because I've blogged about this before. So I'm a massive fan of the exam system, and I'm a massive fan of the way that GCSEs and A-levels are held fairly steady using something called comparable outcomes. And that makes me quite unusual because most people hate comparable outcomes. But I spent a long time with the people of Ofqual, going and visiting them, really understanding it. And I think we are world leading in what we do. And actually what comparable outcomes does is it keeps things incredibly fair. However, having sat and thought through what they're doing with the ranking has an enormous implication for next year, because what should happen is that the grades should genuinely reflect the level of knowledge that the cohort has. The whole system is set up to do that. It is very likely that the year 10 groups and the year 12 groups are going to have had substantial learning loss. And therefore, what do? Do you mark them based on what they actually know, which might be 10% less, and therefore they should get 10% lower grades? Or do we sort of like just give them what they could have won and then boost them up? At which point what we're doing is not only a sort of fabrication and guess of this year, which is like guess their grading and we'll kind of do some maths. We're also then trying to guess what their learning loss is. And I think at that point, the idea that this system is holding anything level or is in any kind of is fair just becomes completely bankrupt. So you've got a couple of options. One is you just don't do the exams at all. The second one is you do them, but you do a bunch of mathematical jiggery pokery. Or the third one, which has been mentioned by Becky Allen, who's my co-founder at Teacher Tapp, is, you know, isn't there a way that we could possibly live in a world where these could be done more flexibly? They could be done online. They could be done at various points in time. We could use the kind of online proctoring systems that are used in universities. And if you don't sit your maths or English at exactly the right time in June, could you sit them at 3 options online over the year? And that might be a hybrid model. So I don't know which one they'll go for, but at the moment, it's a very, very difficult question. Mark, I don't know what you'd add, because you've had to go through it, presumably.
Yeah, it's been great fun. I mean, in terms of do I think there'll be exams next year, I have no idea. Trying to guess what's going on inside the tiny minds of the DFE will drive you insane. So who knows? I think the problem is they don't know and they are scared of making the wrong decision. And so they'll wait until the last possible moment to decide what they're going to do. And we are going to have a year of chaos, not knowing if there are going to be exams or not. So all I'm focused on is teaching my subject as well as I can. I'm just teaching geography. And if my pupils are really good at geography, no matter what the exam looks like, when they do it, the model they do it in, it doesn't matter. They will know lots of geography. And that's why I teach. So I don't care.
Can I jump in there actually with just a few things? One is the data does suggest that the biggest learning loss, actually everyone's very focused on year 10, the biggest learning loss I think will be year 11. Around 1 in 3 schools basically hasn't taught their year 11s at all. And so by the time they get to year 12 and starting A-levels, if they haven't had any teaching since March, particularly in subjects like maths and modern foreign languages, I am really quite concerned about them. And that hasn't happened so much with primary schools. So I don't think the issue of year 6 is actually as big as people think. But you do have to remember they've not been as trained in their English and their maths, but their learning loss was always much bigger over the summer anyway. And so I think the stats thing isn't as big a deal, but the year 11s, there's a serious danger for them.
Brilliant, thank you guys. I think we've probably run out of time for questions now, but that was really, really so informative, so thank you.
Lovely. Well, and that was really brilliant. You know, you never know, do you, when you put this together? You know, we're doing lots of stuff online at the moment, but actually we've, you know, there's 500 or so of you who have attended, and there's been some brilliant content. So hopefully some great things you can take away. So thank you very much to Laura, Mark, obviously to Dele and Naomi as well, for their input. Thank you all for attending. Apologies if you submitted a question that you didn't get a chance to read. You know, hopefully you can get in touch and we can see if we can put them to our panelists. We'll also be following up with a recording of the webinar in case you want to share with any colleagues. There's a survey that we'll be following up with. Please do fill it out if you get a chance. It just helps us for feedback, and also what content you might want to hear from in you know, the next few months beyond this. And also you can get in touch if with any bits and pieces if you want to hear a bit more about MyTutor and how we're doing a bit of online provision with schools as part of their solutions for closing this gap over the next year or so. But look, that's it. Thank you very much for being involved. Stay safe, everyone, and good luck with the sort of return to school that's impending. I wish you all the very best. Thanks very much, everyone.